Welcome to episode 2 of Tim McGee's watercolor vlog. Unlike oils or acrylics, which don't necessarily have to be framed, watercolors need to be framed to protect them because even when dry, the pigment is still water soluble. What that means is if I took this spray bottle and started spraying it on these watercolors that are temporarily stored in my hallway, they would all quickly start running down the paper and the pigment would just run right down the wall. So in order to avoid that unfortunate experience, I frame some of my paintings. In some cases, I simply toss the painting into a $14 Michaels frame and I'm done with it. But occasionally my wife, who gets first dibs on all my paintings, feels that a painting deserves a professional framing. And that can get expensive, but I recently found a solution that makes it a little more reasonable. So far, all of my paintings have been on 9 by 12 inch watercolor paper, which means the finished work with a mat turns out to be about 14 by 17 inches. I've had paintings framed by 3 different local businesses, and the prices have ranged from $90 to $150 up to actually $200, which is getting a little out of hand. Part of that price range comes from the fact that I have, in some cases, requested UV, ultraviolet resistant glass, which is another protective factor. And more about that shortly, but first, some examples. Okay, here we have some watercolors put into $14 Michaels frames, and depending upon the original painting, you could say that these frames are good enough for these works, and so the works are protected, at least from water. This is not UV glass, so these watercolors could fade more quickly than if they had UV protective glass. And now this is an example of a professionally framed watercolor. So it's got a nice mat, it's got a nice frame on it, and this one cost me, I believe, $90 to get this framing done. Whereas this painting, I think, cost me $150 to have framed for 2 reasons. It has UV protective glass, and it has a 2-color, 2-part mat on it, and the actual frame in this case was a slightly more expensive framing material. And this one here, my wife had framed at Jerry's Artorama, and this was the most expensive because it's got a fancier mat, has more expensive framing materials, and has UV protective glass. So this actually probably cost somewhere in the range of $200 to have framed, and that's getting a bit out of control. So what's all this stuff about UV glass? Well, it turns out there is a quality of watercolor paint which is called light fastness. How likely is it to fade or not fade? And so I took a class down at Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts with the wonderful watercolorist by the name of James Toogood. And so one part of that class was talking about different pigments. So here is it's a good quality watercolor. Turner makes good quality watercolors, and this is a popular color. It's called alizarin crimson. But when James Toogood looked at it, he looked on the back and he saw light fastness, 1 star, and he says, you don't want to use that. The reason being, if I mix this red with some blue to make a nice purple and painted some nice grapes and then put them in my watercolor, eventually those watercolor grapes would cease being purple and they would turn blue because this alizarin crimson would have faded. The solution is to purchase a Winsor Newton permanent alizarin crimson. So one of the things I now know is that the watercolors that I use are specifically chosen to be quite light fast. Right. They're unlikely to fade. That said, any watercolor will fade. If you had a watercolor sitting on a wall and the sun shone on it for several hours each day, it would fade much more than if you had it in a place where the sun was not shining on it. And then finally, you can purchase a couple different degrees of ultraviolet resistance. Now, these again get more expensive. So a sheet of ultra UV resistant glass that's museum quality to go on a 9x12 watercolor. The glass alone is going to be $100. You don't have to go to that degree of like 90% UV resistant. So I have found this place that provides UV resistant with a rating of 70 resistance, and that's going to be highly resistant. So the combination of light fast pigments, some pretty good UV resistance in the glass, hanging it on a wall where you are not being directly, have the sun shining directly upon it, then these watercolors should have pretty good permanence. So now what I'm going to do is demonstrate how I am going to frame a work of mine from this frame kit that I ordered online, which reduces the cost of a good frame for one of my watercolors from the $100 range down to the $50 range. All right, so this is the solution that I have come up with to have quality framing of my watercolors at about half the price of what it would cost to have it done at a store. These are two frames. There's the front and this is the back, and this is from an online provider called West Charlton. And so what I did was I entered the dimensions of the watercolor picture and then chose a frame style. I chose a matte thickness. I chose, in this case, to have the 70% UV protection on the glass. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just take the back off. It has these little metal clips, just like you would get in the $14 Michaels frame. Take the back off, attach my watercolor to the backing material using so this artist quality tape, put it back together, and I will soon have one of my favorite watercolors, the one which is Cows at Church, framed in a nice frame for about half the price of what it would have cost me to have it done in a local shop, half to 1/3 of the price. All right then, there we have it. I have framed Cows at Church in a West Charlton mail order frame. Because I ordered more than $70 worth, the shipping was free. So I got two of them at $54 each, and this would have cost me anywhere from $100 to $150 to have this done with this quality of UV glass protection. So this is the end of my blog about framing watercolor pictures. Talk to you later.